Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. Today we are so grateful to welcome Emeritus Professor of Clinical and Community Psychology, Jim Orford. Jim works at the University of Birmingham and he trained as a clinical psychologist before developing an interest particularly in addiction, which included being a founding member of the Addiction and Family International Network, which now has over 500 members and is operating in over 50 countries. Over the years, Jim developed increasing interest in social and community orientation to psychology and writing what were at the time already existing British textbooks of community psychology. He also co-founded the British Psychological Society's Community Psychology section and the European Community Psychology Association. His current interests are in the psychology of war and militarism and the psychology of economic inequality. We were particularly interested in inviting Jim to join us on this episode today, as we were acutely aware of what's happening in the world in various countries and interested to explore what psychology has to offer on the subject, and also reflecting on any potential parallels between how we might understand and intervene in terms of violence within forensic psychology. So you're very welcome to the episode today, Jim. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey into psychology?
My journey into psychology, yes, thank you very much for inviting me. It started a long time ago, and I trained as a clinical psychologist in the early 1960s, and I moved fairly quickly into research. So I trained at what is now the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, part of King's College now. And I fairly soon came back. It was the opportunity to do a PhD, and there was a new research unit devoted to addiction. It was in the days when illicit drugs were just beginning to be a problem. And the MRC with the Department of Health decided they were going to set up a research unit at the Institute. And I was engaged as a psychologist and did my PhD there. And then, so addiction became my, bread and butter main topic of study and interest, really pretty much for the rest of my career. And it still is. And I was doing a research project early on particularly on families and how addiction affected the family and how they were involved in the treatment of addiction. So that's also become a major interest of mine. And we set up, sort of 10 or so years ago now, we set up a thing called AFINET, which is the Addiction and the Family International Network, which has got its next annual conference in Quebec, and I'm going to talk at that conference in July. No, in May. I beg your pardon. And so that's been my main interest all along. But clinical psychology, I probably because addiction is a subject that you can't look at addiction without thinking of wider issues like who is providing the addictive substances, who's should we legalize it, should we ban smoking, should we legalize recreational drugs, all those sorts of issues. And it was at that time that I discovered something called community psychology. And there was no community psychology in Britain and hardly any in Europe, but it was very active in the United States and in one or two other countries. And I found that very interesting. And later on, I started to call myself a clinical and community psychologist and was quite involved in setting up the community psychology section of the British Psychological Society. And I was influential in starting a European Community Psychology Association, which is still going, and it's got its annual conference in Lisbon, I think, later this year. And I think as I moved towards retirement, I think I've moved towards political psychology. So I think the kind of conferences that appeal to me now are conferences in political psychology. So I think I've moved I've moved from being clinical. I still am, still am a clinical psychologist, although not practicing now, not practiced for a long time. But so I think I've moved from clinical psychology to community psychology to political psychology. But basically, I've been in psychology a long time, and I love psychology. It's it's been a big part of my life.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think as psychologists, we wouldn't necessarily think of ourselves as being political, but we do tend to go into political issues, particularly around things that affect people in prison and hospitals. So we drift into it as well by accident almost. But also feeling that we have got something to say in that arena. So it's really helpful to see how you got into that side. And you can see it's natural again with what you talk about addiction. It's a very political issue, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. It must be the same in forensic
Yeah,
psychology.
there's lots of overlap.
As you say, yeah.
When we think about an individual, we're not just looking at it from the individual's perspective, we're looking at it from a systemic community level as well, which I think is really powerful and really important. People don't operate in isolations, they're within different systems and communities, and thinking about behaviour from that perspective is really quite a public health issue, actually, in terms of what you're speaking to in terms of political psychology.
Yes, that's very much what intrigued me about community psychology when I first came across it. It wasn't something I'd been taught, and it didn't come into my training as a clinical psychologist very much, but it was really exciting to discover it.
So could you tell us how you got into writing a book about war and about the psychology of war? Your book called On the Warpath. We'll put it into the show notes, but it sounds a really interesting and topical sort of discussion at the moment.
Yes, well, writing about war, writing my book about war has been a labor of love, I can tell you, because my interest in war goes back also a long way, and I think the idea of writing about the psychology of war is something that has been on my mind for many years. And I think I say in the introduction to the book that it went right back, I think, to my teenage years when I was born during the Second World War, and my father served in Europe and finished the war in India. So my mother was effectively a single parent for me until I didn't really meet my father until I was about the age of 4. And I don't know how influential that was, but I certainly, and my father didn't talk like so many people who've fought in wars. He didn't talk very much about it, and I didn't ask him much about it. But I don't know, watching films, watching newsreels, maybe. I just developed as a teenager, I think, a horror of sort of killing people for some sort of greater purpose. I couldn't really understand. It seemed extraordinary to me as a young person. And the other thing that I remember was our local library where I was brought up as a teenager, and finding some interesting books about war, and then finding that there were whole shelves of books devoted to weapons of war. And I thought how very odd this was. And I began to think, well, actually, people say they don't like war, but I'm not sure that's true. I think there's quite a lot of evidence that people in some ways actually rather like war. And that was the idea that I carried forward, all the time when I was working as a psychologist. I thought one day I'm going to explore this a bit further. And as I moved towards retirement, I was able, to read around the subject, and the idea that there was a book there to be written finally came to me. And it wasn't really until the COVID era that I had a bit more time to settle down and actually write it and actually produce it. So it was a long, the gestation period for a book on war was a long one. And it was something that meant a lot to me, and it was something I wanted to do for a very long time.
And what are the key messages from the book, Jim?
Well, what the book is about is about how we support war. It's about how people, ordinary people, find themselves supporting war. So what I found when I was reading about the subject is that when people write about war, they're normally writing about the politicians and how the politicians have decided, because war, it turns out, is basically a political activity. It's politics, as I think von Clausewitz, the Prussian general, probably said. War is politics by other means, I think he said. That's often quoted. So it's a political activity. So you can understand why people write so much about the politicians and how they came to decide about war, or how the military, how the generals, decided how war should be conducted. And there's not a lot written about how we give our politicians and our generals the support they need in order to take us to war, because certainly in a democracy, they've got to have at least some support from the general population. And even in countries where not so democratic, if the people in general decided they just weren't going to do it, they were not going to go to war, then it couldn't take place. So that was the question that I was particularly interested in. Why are people so interested in weapons? Why what is it about war that we find? Are we attracted to war? Do we actually like war? And I found not many people were writing about that, and certainly not many psychologists were writing about it. There'd been the one book that I think I came across that's anywhere near what I was trying to do was a book written by somebody called Lawrence Lashan over 20 years ago now, called The Psychology of War. But on the whole, psychologists have not attended to that. There's peace psychology, of course, and there's the American Psychological Association has its division 48, which is about peace, conflict, and violence. But peace psychology is not quite the same as war psychology. It's a lot of it is about conflict resolution, about how groups make peace after a war has occurred, and even sometimes there's a thread of argument in peace psychology, which is that the absence of war is not good if there is no social justice. So in other words, there is that thread within peace psychology which says that actually war sometimes is justified in order to correct social ills of injustice, which is interesting. Might come back to that later. But and psychologists, of course, sometimes have colluded in war by accepting funds from defense, the government, defense departments in the United States, in Britain, and elsewhere, to fund their research is one way. And psychologists have been involved in recruitment, psychometric testing of recruitment. In fact, I think I was always told as a young clinical psychologist that was part of the origins of clinical psychology, certainly in Britain, was psychometric testing of recruits to the forces during the second war. So the very start of my profession was tied up with war in that sort of way. And then psychologists, of course, have got involved in egregious things like torture. I mean, the Guantanamo Bay torture, and which has been a huge issue for the American Psychological Association. So that's where that's where it starts. So I suppose one question I wanted to answer was, am I right that actually people do find war quite attractive, even though they may also find it terrible and horrendous and awful, but there's large bits of us as human beings that find war actually quite attractive. That was one question. And then the second question was, if that is the case, and I was starting up assuming, well, I was going to find that it was the case, how can we explain the process whereby we give, we give our approval to moving towards war? So that was basically what I was looking at. That was what it was about, essentially.
It's really interesting. I can see the overlap then with your community psychology, because there's lots of when people, and I often wonder why, the news and people keep commemorating the war years and years and years later, and how this sort of community spirit that was sort of seen, the war effort, everybody pulling together, and how that was seen at a time and often lamented, oh, we're not like that anymore, we don't pull together. And you can see that aspect of it. But I guess it's how we can do that without having to kill people to do it. How do we get that? That's what I was wondering from, has it been something you looked at? Because that seems to be something that people really enjoyed. If you say people like war, enjoyed of the war, was that sort of community effort that we're all in this together. And I think we saw that during COVID as well, that we're all in this together, fighting a common sort of enemy of COVID as it was then, or a war.
Yes, I mean, you've touched there on several of the key things that I found when collecting material for the book. I mean, basically the book's built. It's built around 6 topics really. When I was reading all around them, and I should say I was reading, because psychology hasn't attended to this all that much. I was reading people who, historians. Historians, big source of psychological ideas about why we support war. Journalists, Fergal Keane is one of my favorite people. He's written a lovely book called, I think his memoirs, yes, Memoirs of Love and War, I think it's called. It's particularly about the Irish Civil War in the 1920s, because his family were involved in it. It's an area of Ireland he knows very well. So that's a lovely book. So journalists, veterans, social scientists of various sorts that I was trying to draw on. But so anyway, when I got the material, I organized it in 6 topics, and one of the topics was this very issue of the things people say about having been involved in war. It's so common for people to say, I never felt more alive, I never felt more excited. This was a time of my life. I remember there was the pulling together, the comradeship, all the things you've just mentioned, Jerry, there. So that was one topic. The second topic was then about what are the causes that people say they're fighting for. So nationalism was a big thing. So I spent quite a bit of time trying to disentangle the various ideas about nationalism. Is it the same as patriotism? Nationalism means very different things to different people. And I decided that you could, in the end, very roughly, you could divide nationalisms into two poles, really. One was what I would call benign nationalism, where you can be proud of your country, you can be proud of your group, but it doesn't say anything about your derogation or your dislike of other people. At the other end of the scale is something that you might call chauvinistic nationalism, which is nationalism which is superior, which thinks you're better than others, that denigrates people in other countries or other cultures or other groups. So it was about that. That was the second topic. The third topic, which drew very heavily on social identity theory and social contact theory in social psychology, which was really about how you start to think of people as not just competitors, but as possible enemies. And how you think about yourself as a group. So it's all about in groups and out groups, and the more you drift towards war, the more essential it is that people fall into line and define themselves as part of your in group and support what you're doing. And people who don't, of course, start to get victimized, and people who want to talk to Putin, start to get called appeasers. the whole idea of appeasement starts coming. So very much in groups and out groups is the third topic. The fourth topic then was about militarism. And this played a central part really in the book, the idea that actually we are embedded in a militaristic culture. There's all sorts of ways in which our culture is a militaristic one. So we're in a sense prepared. We're always prepared for war because we understand that we need a big defense, as it's called, industry. We need armaments. There's always a possibility that we may need to fight other groups or other countries. So militarism was the fourth topic. The fifth topic was propaganda. And what I really discovered was, I mean, I knew propaganda was important, but what I really came to the conclusion was that war is impossible without propaganda. War and propaganda go together, that all wars, as one person put it, are thought wars, all of them. Consent has to be engineered. So war and propaganda go together. In very, very interesting topic I found. And the sixth topic, which was again really intriguing, was about morality. How is it that we can square what we do when we're going to war or supporting war or thinking about war? How can we square that with our moral teachings? I mean, the way we were brought up to think that, harming other people was wrong. Even raising one's fist to another person is wrong, let alone actually deliberately killing other people in their cause. So those are the six topics. And along the way, there are all sorts of subtopics, which you could write. Well, people have written whole books about, and I could have written a whole book about it. I mean, one is masculinity. It's extraordinary the degree to which weapons and defense and war and fighting war is so much a masculine, male-dominated activity. So the question is it an example of toxic masculinity? Is that what war is? Is war a boys' game, really? Is it a men's game? What's women's attitude towards war? So that was a fascinating subject. I could only devote part of the chapter to it, but it's a really, really interesting topic, I think. That another one which you mentioned, Jerry, I think, was war memorials. And do war memorials and war ceremonies, do they serve the interest of peace? Are they telling us that this is something we should never do again? Or are they actually telling us that serving in war, and particularly those who've lost their lives and given their lives, that this is one of the ultimate services that one can give to one's group? So if you're really cynical, is the annual armistice ceremony around the cenotaph, is it actually a recruiting exercise? Is that what it is? Is it actually telling our young people that, this is, if we need to go to war, you can do the best thing you can possibly do for us, which is putting your lives on the line. So you could be really cynical about it, which is why I think something, those red poppies, if people appear on the television and sort of, around Armistice Day, it's almost de rigueur to wear a red poppy. So, and I think the red poppy is actually ambiguous, which is why I try and wear a white poppy as well. I know some people wear a red poppy and a white poppy, because the white poppy, I think, is not ambiguous. It's really saying we're against war, we're for peace and against war. The red poppy, I think, and all that is ambiguous. And then another really fascinating area is this area of morality. My last topic is the role of religions. You would think, wouldn't you, that religions, thinking that harming people is bad, killing people is bad, they'd be against war. Well, they're not. They all they all say that war is just. And so I found myself looking at just war theory, which is interesting, which goes back to Thomas Aquinas and Hugo Grotius and other people along in Christian history. But it's the same with all the other religions. They all, in one way or another, say that war, bad though it is legitimate in order to right wrongs. And I found that utterly fascinating. So there were all these subtopics that I just, as I went on, I found really intriguing.
And is there a difference, do you think, between wars? I mean, you mentioned the troubles in Northern Ireland. I mean, are there difference in wars between or within one country against each other, or sort of between one country and another country, do you think?
Well, that's also so interesting. I mean, the Mary Calder wrote a book some years ago called New and Old Wars. And her idea was that most wars now are not straightforward wars between countries, which is why the Ukraine and Russia war is so interesting, that that is nowadays a rather unusual war, a straightforward war between two countries. She says most wars now are what she calls new wars. They're intra-state rather than interstate wars, and they get terribly complicated. So you take Syria, for example, or you take what's going on in the eastern part of the Congo, Sudan. They're often not just between civil war like the Spanish Civil War. Spanish Civil War was, I remember reading Hugh Thomas's book about the Spanish Civil War when I was a sort of older teenager, and found it absolutely fascinating. It was one of the things also that got me interested in war. But that was a much more straightforward civil war between two ideologically very opposed groups of people, very different ideas about how Spain should be governed. But now, so many of the wars are very complicated with, think of Syria with, ISIS and the Kurds and the Alawites and and loads of other groups. So I think that's very interesting. There's also a very interesting book I came across by somebody called Martin Shaw called the New Western Way of War. And his idea was that Western countries, United States perhaps particularly, the favoured way now of waging war is to wage war at some distance away, often using unmanned aerial vehicles or drones or things. So keeping down your own combatants, casualties as much as you possibly, and doing it at arms, very much remotely in other countries. So yes, war has changed very much, but I think what I was writing about I think is relevant. I think is relevant to all kinds of wars, or it needs to be. Any model of war needs to be relevant to all those different kinds of war. Yeah.
I was really thinking about the 6 different strands and how complex and how layered that is really. And I don't think I've ever thought about war in such a layered kind of process really. But what I was really struck by was, I think as you were talking, Jim, was this notion of legal versus illegal violence. So what we might think about as practitioners in forensic and researchers in forensic settings is, the psychological processes that people need to overcome in order to commit violence. And there is a real resonance with some of what you're talking about with, I think some of the people that we work with as well who commit this notion of illegal violence. And I wondered if you could just, I suppose, speak a little bit more about that, actually, about some of the psychological processes that we need to overcome, I suppose, to support war as a society, but also at a kind of a government level as well.
Yes, I mean, when you first invited me to do this, I thought, why would a group of forensic psychologists be asking me to talk about war? And because one of the distinctive features about war is it's a collective activity. It's not something that individuals do. It has to be part of a collective, a nation, or a cultural group, or a tribal group, or whatever it is, or a religious group. Whereas I suppose many people like me would think of crime as being individuals. It's individuals who commit crimes. I know that's an oversimplification, but that's how one might think. So I thought, why on earth would you be asking me? And then, because I knew you were going to ask me the question. So I thought, well, and the more I thought about it, I thought, well, there's large areas of overlap. One of the areas of overlap, obviously, is that there are crimes committed during war. Rape is, we know, perhaps connected obviously with the fact that it's a male, so much a male activity that, rape has occurred, throughout the histories of war, sadly, and also sometimes as a deliberate, a deliberate weapon of war. So that's one area. Sexual crime, I suppose, is one area of overlap. Another area of overlap that I came across, that was very interesting, was terrorism. And some people would think of terrorism as not war, particularly if it's committed by individual people. But I'm not sure. It's very much in between somewhere. And I came across a theory which I hadn't come across before, particularly put forward by somebody called Ari Kruglansky. It's called the 3 N's model of terrorism. And the 3 N's are need, by which I think they mean people are particularly inclined to terrorism if their own circumstances are such that then they're either finding life really difficult economically, socially. They're oppressed by their circumstances, or they find they have no purpose in life, no meaning in life. So that's their claim is that need. People have a psychological need to do things. So I guess there must be a link there with a lot of crime, I imagine. And the second one is N for narrative. And that played a big part in what I was writing. So the idea that when people accept the idea that one might need to go to war, they're particularly prone to believe in a narrative which talks about often the history of one's group, why it is that one's own group is being threatened by another group. So something about the narrative, and the morality thing comes in there as well. So again, I can't help thinking that there's a lot of overlap there with the kind of crime, that forensic psychology is going to be interested in. How do people, because to commit crimes, I guess you've got to be doing things that either you don't know it's wrong, or you can justify, you somehow justify the fact that you're doing this. So that's an area, and I don't know how much there is in forensic psychology about that, but the whole sort of idea is how you justify what you're doing. Your beliefs about what you're doing seems to me very important. And the third N in this 3 N's model is network. So the idea that some terrorists may act completely alone, but a lot of terrorists are acting, even if they don't commit the terror, even if they commit the terrorism on their own, they're actually connected with a network of people that support their terrorist views. And again, presumably that's highly relevant to almost all crime, I imagine, that people who commit crimes are presumably often part of groups that also commit those crimes, or they're part of a subculture that favors that crime, or indeed they're part of collectives, some sort of crime of cannot be done on your own, I guess. So that I thought was very interesting. So it's that's one of the areas I think where one can see big overlaps with crime.
And could you tell us about your model of war support that you've developed? I guess through all your reading of what little literature there was available.
Yes, yes. Thank you for asking me about that. That's where I finished up, was developing this thing I call a model of war support. And the reason I came to that was that throughout these 6 topics that I looked at, although they were quite diverse topics, there were 3 themes that kept on coming up. And they form the core of what I call this model of war support. The first is preparation for war, and the idea that even at an early stage, we're not actually thinking war is likely, where any particular war is possible. We haven't identified an enemy. No question that we're going to war at the moment. We're always prepared for war. And interestingly enough, William James, who, as you know, is often thought of as one of the first psychologists, he spoke about preparation for war. I think he said something like the real war is preparation for war. So the way in which we are all embedded within a culture that thinks, defense, military is one of the most important things that a nation does for its citizens, is to defend it and to have arms and spend money, whether it's 2.5% of GDP or whether it's 3% or whether it's 5%, just the kind of things that are being talked about at the moment. However much it is, it's one of the central purposes and obligations of government. So that's one. But there's all sorts of ways in which preparation for war is there. The just war theory, is there. Religions, tell us that war is always possible and is often necessary to right wrongs. So that was the first thing. The second thing then was threat. And wherever I looked, whatever particular topic was I was looking for, the word threat kept on coming up. Whether it was research that's been done on individual differences, in the degree to which we all see the world as dangerous and threatening. So there's been research on that, and we differ. So people who think that the world is a dangerous and threatening place, generally, are people who have more positive attitudes to war, or less negative attitudes towards war. So that was one thing. But then there's the narratives about in-groups and out-groups, the narratives about other groups and whether they're threatening, history, our histories, and how we can easily be threatened, and also how easily that is to resurrect old enmities. So I think the Balkans is a very interesting example of how I was brought up to think of Yugoslavia as one country. I didn't know there were animosities, deeply ingrained animosities between Croats and Serbs and Bosnians and so on. And of course, as soon as Yugoslavia started to break up, that all came to the surface and resulted in some ghastly wars of a very complex kind. The partition of India and Pakistan. It was, people were living together as neighbors, and then suddenly they turned on each other at the time of partition of India. So there's the threat element that comes in, which is really, really important. So it worries me terribly when I hear I hear our politicians saying, as they have been saying recently, we're living in an increasingly threatening world, or increasingly dangerous world. Because when I hear that, according to my model, that means that we are taking a step further towards the possibility of war. So I hate to hear that, and the idea that we should be spending, we should be increasing the amount of money that we spend on the military, rather than increasing, money on aid, aid to countries where war might conceivably break out, or that worries me too, because if my model is right, then these are all steps that take us a little bit nearer towards the actuality of war. So that was the second threat. And the third part of the model is what I call simplistic thinking. So it fits in with this idea in psychology of the contrast between complex thinking and simplistic thinking, that almost everything about war depends on simplistic thinking. The narrative about what is our history has to be simplified. Our concept of ourselves, our concept of our potential enemies, propaganda is always simplified. It's grossly simplified thinking. So that's the third part. That if you want to move towards war, then do those three. Think simplistically about it all, rather than in a more complex, deliberative fashion. Tell us that we're threatened. I mean, the second Gulf War was a good example, as we know. The threat of weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be wrong. But threat we can be told in all sorts of ways that we're threatened. The thing that's going on at the moment that worries me, of course, is what we're being told about Russia and Ukraine. Is that actually we are being threatened. It's not just Ukraine that are being threatened, but Russia poses a threat to our whole way of life, the whole Western way of life. And again, that worries me, because that is simplistic thinking. I mean, one can see sense in that, or one can see nonsense in that, but it certainly is a step towards the possibility of war with Russia if we are persuaded by our politicians and our media that that our whole way of life is threatened by Russia, or indeed by China. These are worrying things. So there's so that's the model. That's the model, basically. Those three things. And then the other essential bit of the model is that all those three interact. They all encourage one another. But as we go on the path towards war, they all increase. So the preparation for war, which was probably the biggest to start with, grows a bit, but the other two grow enormously. So the perception of threat as we get near to war grows very considerably, and the simplistic thinking grows as well. And one of the bits that I think is really significant about all that is that the way we think about ourselves and the need to be thinking in the same simplistic way. So anybody who breaks ranks and says, look, I'm going to try and understand where Putin's coming from. I'm going to try and understand a bit of Russian history here, because I don't think most of us know anything, the first thing about Russian history and, the history of Russia and, Russia and Ukraine. We're just told, we're just told that, Putin is some sort of psychopath, that he's trying to restore the Russian Empire. That's about all we're told. So the simplistic thinking grows and gets worse. So that's over time. So time is a big element. And so
what are the practical implications then of your model, Jim, just in terms of how, for preventing future wars? What can we do in terms of kind of as psychologists or just as people in society in terms of how we prevent future wars based on your model?
Right. Yes. Well, the sooner you can prevent wars, the better. So if I was asked, what would I do about Russia and Ukraine, I'd probably say, well, I wouldn't start here because, we've got, the whole thing is so entrenched. But Russia and Ukraine is an interesting one, because I think the position we've got to now is that we're now contemplating something that we didn't contemplate before, which is actually British troops on the ground in Ukraine, and that would mean that that we are in effect at war with Russia. We've almost been at war with Russia already. I mean, our support for Ukraine has been so total, and the media, the BBC, the BBC couldn't be, couldn't really look at both sides. So the BBC's had to be brought into line and basically support Ukraine, as most of us do. But I think we're looking at something different now, and I think that's worrying. And but I think the big one, to prevent war, I think, is China, because we've an opportunity to get in early enough, I think, to prevent things getting out of hand with China. So I think the message would be maintain contact, because I think contact theory, I wasn't very familiar with contact theory before, but it's one of, so I'm told, one of the best established social psychological theories, is the idea that the more contact you have with other groups, the less likely you are to be prejudiced against them. So maintain contact. So one of the things you may remember in the past, Conservative Prime Minister, just forgot his name for the moment, who thought that we should have better relations with China. And even George Osborne, I think, who actually knew China quite well. I think, I understand, as a student, George Osborne actually spent quite a bit of time in China and touring around bits of China, and he was certainly very keen to maintain contact with China. Well, that's not so popular now, but I do think that is one thing we should do. Incidentally, I thought it was a real mistake when the British Psychological Society decided very, very soon after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, they decided to agree that Russian psychologists. That I think, was it the BPS was going to resign from the international group of psychologists somewhere. I forget quite the details now, but anyway, the idea was to cut off relations with Russian psychologists, and I thought that was a mistake, really. That one should have maintained contact with Russian psychologists. Might not agree with them, but at least you could carry on dialogue. So carrying on dialogue, I think, and having contact, I think, is absolutely vital. Trying to think in as deliberative and complex way about the issues as you possibly can, instead of just agreeing with some of the media and politicians who say that China is an autocracy, it's a threat to our way of life, they're completely different from us. Just to try and understand China. I mean, apparently all Chinese children, as part of their education, are brought up to understand the humiliation that China has experienced at the hands of the West and others, particularly in the last 19th and 20th centuries. Hong Kong comes into it. So trying to understand where China is and why they're doing what they're doing, to try and see things from both sides, is a really important thing. And I think to try to tone down the language of threat is very important. So I think I think we've time with China to actually prevent, because a war between the West and China would be really quite utterly awful, I think, and we've got to prevent it, and we've got to do our best to prevent it.
Because I was reading when in sort of preparation for this and thinking about the internet, because I guess in more than we ever did before, we do have contact with people all over the world, which we might never have had without that. So I would think that would help people to think, well, I know somebody there, which is sort of simplistic, but it's not, a blanket of they're all like that we might see on the news, because I do see what you say about the peppering in on the news of threats, things that we need to think about. And it is just very subtle at times about that, but you can almost see that. I mean, I don't know this intimately at all, this area, but I've seen that it's ramping up. They're bringing troops over into countries so they're closer to Ukraine. And I think there's a difference between funding weapons for Ukraine and putting boots on the ground. That's a very big difference to me as a expert in this area. That does mean you're at war with somebody if you're fighting them physically rather than sending weapons. They are quite different, aren't they? To me, that seems quite different.
Yes, very much so.
I was also really struck by what you were saying, Jim, around how we as people, professionals, psychologists, just as a society, make space for more nuanced thinking about dilemmas and problems. And I think, I'm not sure, Jerry, what you think, but as practitioners, we really try and encourage that in terms of people that we work with, not to kind of engage in that simplistic or black and white thinking, that we think a little bit more complex, and think about, the other person's perspective, or a different, mentalizing, and then all those sorts of psychological tools that we can kind of draw on. I was just really struck by what you were saying and how we maintain a critical perspective on what we are exposed to through the media, through the internet, or just through, the system that we live in. I was really struck by that. And so what are you working on now, Jim? What's your next book?
Well, yes, actually, my next book is just about to come out. So which is on a different topic. It's also, I would claim, political psychology, but it's called The Psychology of Economic Inequality. So it's basically about how we're putting up with such enormous inequality of incomes and wealth, which we never had when the first half of my life, I thought we were becoming more equal. And the second half of my life, we seem to be becoming more unequal again. And this is bad. This is bad for us. But that's, I'm waiting for the proofs of that to arrive, and it's going to be an open access book. So that's, so it's available to anybody to look at. But what I'm kind of thinking about now for a possible another book, which is more related to the war material, and it's very related to what you were just saying, Kate, is to try and put war and my war support model into a broader perspective, which is about conflict and how we deal with conflict, and how we really ought to get much better at dealing with conflict, because conflict is dangerous. Not just war, but all sorts of conflict are bad. And I realized that actually throughout my career as a psychologist, a lot of what I've been concerned about is about conflict. I mean, addiction, the conflicts around addiction, the conflicts that addiction creates within the family, various family therapy, couple therapy, and some methods in that area, and other clinical areas, all about conflict. So what I'm enjoying at the moment is reading around topics like that, and what you were just saying, Kate, about how we deliberate about things, and how we talk to one another about things, and how we tolerate other people who appear to have different views of ourselves. I mean, one of the areas I didn't look at very much in the war stuff, but I came across, and was conflict resolution. and a number of people, writing in the area of international mediation, international conflict resolution, which is really interesting. But then, of course, once you start to look at mediation, it's all over the place. I mean, conflict mediation in the workplace, conflict mediation in all sorts of areas. And I'm just reading at the moment a tome about citizens' assemblies. Now, citizens' assemblies are very interesting because I don't know if you know much about them. I didn't know think much about them before, but they're becoming very popular, of ways of getting together representative groups of people who have, because they're representative of the population, they have very different views about a particular issue. And the idea is that by spending a lot of time, several weekends together, given various information about the topic, and deliberating, the word deliberation is used a lot, deliberating together, trying to understand other people's points of view, they come towards some sort of consensus, which is then fed into policy making, fed into the political process. So that's just one example, but that's what I'm sort of struggling with at the moment, is something about conflict. How can we call ourselves Homo sapiens, but we're not terribly sapiens really about, if conflict is absolutely endemic, and if we've got weapons of mass destruction, which we have, and there's conflict, and there's been a lot, hasn't there, in all our media all the time about how we're getting worse. We're getting worse about talking to each other about things we might disagree about. So I think there's something. Yeah, I think there's a book there somewhere, but it's going to take a long time. And ask me again in 5 years' time if I manage to write that one.
It sounds really, really interesting. Yeah, thank you very much for coming along. It's been really great talking to you. And I do have to end it with a particular line that we end all our episodes with, Jim, which is "Let's talk forensic psychology."